World Museum for the Being Human Festival. The Being Human Festival is a festival of humanities. It's running this year between November 14th and 23rd, and there are events all across the UK, and the idea is to showcase what's being done in humanities research. So how this relates to my research is that I'm a scholar of colonial violence. I work on India. I work on different aspects of colonial violence in India and to some extent in other colonial contexts. And I think this is really a time when we need to be talking more about these issues. I've had the privilege of teaching and working in quite a few different countries, all of them, interestingly enough, former British colonies. And in each case, the sort of stuff that I do was just par for the course, and there was never a case of having to sort of, explain it. In Ireland or in India, I mean, they get colonialism, they understand violence. Ditto US, Canada, and other places, Australia as well. But the UK is in quite a different situation when it comes to empire, isn't it? It's still something we either don't like to talk about, or if we do talk about it, we talk about it largely in a positive way, right? And we still seem to have this vision of sort of these valiant, it's mostly white men, isn't it? Valiant white men sort of going off to these benighted parts of the world, and it's still viewed in this way, civilizing, right? And of course the problem with that is you can't colonize a quarter of the world's people and do it that way, right? It entails tremendous violence, from the act of conquest itself to colonialism, which entailed economic violence, various forms of structural violence, political violence, violence to the cultures of the peoples colonized. And part of that violence, of course, included all the stuff that was hauled away from those contexts, and it's ended up in museums here in the UK. So national museums in the UK, and private museums as well then, are full of this material. They're not very good at negotiating that or dealing with that, or thinking how we talk about that. And for the most part, national museums in the UK just maintain a code of silence. There's all this stuff that's put on display, but the histories of those objects, how they were acquired by the museums, what they tell us about colonialism, those are the sorts of things that museums don't talk about. So it's exciting to be doing something like this at World Museum. So what the project actually entails, the bulk of the project, is a trail that you can do through the collections in the museum. And with the head of ethnology here, Emma Martin, I've selected a series of objects that I think reveal an awful lot about empire and talked about how they got here. So this is one of those cases when you get to really find out, okay, what's behind the history of these objects. And I love it that you said, Emily, that you found it quite moving doing that, going through the trail. So there are trail maps out in the atrium, and you can give this a shot, and hopefully you will, to explore more about the museum's collection. So it's quite an amazing thing for a national museum in the UK to be doing something like this. And in fact, World Museum is in the process of completely reconceiving of its World Cultures Gallery and how it deals with these sorts of issues. And this is part of that process. So that is really exciting. And another thing that brings us here, and why we've got students and we've got students debating, is because there's another really tense issue in the UK, and that's to do with universities and what they're doing in relation to empire and what they're doing in terms of decolonising their curriculum. So that is something I'm very involved in at the University of Liverpool. And that is also what this debate is about, and it's to get insights from the students and from you about what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, and those sorts of things. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it over to Emily.
Hi everyone, so my name's Emily Warrilow, and I'm one of Deana's PhD students. So thank you so much for coming today to our student panel discussion on the Untold Histories of Empire. Now, the way museums represent histories is crucial to the way that we, as members of the public, engage with and understand our pasts. But whose pasts are we actually talking about? Now, there's all corners of the globe that are represented in this museum, but the way that they're represented isn't always equal. So what is the impact of that, and how does that impact the way people understand their own history? These are all kinds of questions that we're going to be discussing today on the panel, and we're very honoured to have 5 of our very own University of Liverpool students here. So we've got Emma Oudheusden, I think I said that wrong, who is currently studying a Masters in Cultural History. We've got Jessica Songer, who is currently an undergraduate studying Ancient History with a Minors in Egyptology. We've got Mara Livermore, who is doing a Masters in Research in Slavery. We've got David Edwards, who is doing a Masters in Cultural History as well. And we've got Abyan Mohamed, who's doing an undergraduate degree in Politics with a minor in History. So we're going to get started shortly. Before we do, I do think it's important to acknowledge that some of the issues we'll be talking about today can potentially bring up some quite sensitive issues. Now, it shouldn't need to be said, but obviously we do want this to be a discussion that is a debate that can be had respectfully, so people can express their opinions and have arguments about them in a respectful manner. So just to stipulate, this is going to be a safe space today, and there won't be any tolerance of discriminatory or offensive language. Thank you. So we'll get started. So our first question for the panel is, how can museums do justice to histories of empire, colonialism, racism and violence given their public audience? Who wants to start? Mara?
Okay, so how can they do justice given the audience? I think I would appreciate, on one hand, some clarity sometimes around who the audience is, because I definitely don't feel... I've gone through being a very avid museum and gallery visitor, to increasingly feeling completely disenfranchised from these kinds of cultural events, and I still enjoy them, but I can't help but walk around and feel like it's not designed for me, it's not meant for me. And then also as my academic knowledge increases, in particular around African traditional religions and items of significance, I'm increasingly arrested by things that I see and I'm like, well, that's just really not okay. And I think that the museums have a mammoth task in front of them to address these legacies, but there's and who they're speaking to is going to change what narratives, because obviously there are things that are important to me that are in particular as like an African studies person that are in particular about like this framing of Africa, and we have so much African stuff here yet we can't get the public to consistently understand that it's not a country, it's a continent, so there has to be something going wrong there. But then that for other people it might be more about helping them understand that despite that history there's room for forward progress, and so there's this looking backwards and looking forwards that I think, you know, the museums, if there's one thing that they do have, which is hopefully time and expertise, to, I guess, break it down and tackle them bit by bit. And
What would you say to that, Emma?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think you point out quite interestingly and like also accurately that it's museums seem to be very focused on like the white public in that way, or at least of an understanding of people that visit, which in a country such as Britain is quite multicultural. So it should be, you know, at least to each object, or at least to each tale that you tell, you should have several different narratives so that people can actually properly understand what's going on and what they tend to represent, rather than a very white focused, or at least white research focused explanation of artifacts. And I think a way forward would definitely be to expand that, and I think as soon as you say that, people tend to frighten away a bit, and it's like white people can't engage in this discussion, which I don't think that's what's being said. It's more so that you need to expand narratives in order to get a broader understanding of things, and that's definitely that museums should do.
It's about narrative though. If we're saying that, like for example, the Museum of Liverpool has the World Cultures section, that is only Asia, Americas, Oceania and Asia, and Africa, sorry. what else is there in the world? There's Europe. It doesn't include Europe. If it's the world culture section, it needs to be the world and not just the homogenous rest of the world that isn't Europe. By pushing it into a section like that, you're saying that it's a completely separate space and a separate people, which just continues the colonial othering that we want to get away from, I think, as a country.
But also kind of going off of that, the fact that we're talking about these narratives and these spaces that are predominantly in the West, or like that are outside of Africa, that are outside of Asia, where a lot of these collections kind of are from, that brings up a question of the people that have access to these, whether they be like majority white people, there's still the people kind of who have historical ties to them, or who it's relevant to like their culture, have pretty much no access to it unless they kind of, unless they travel over here, which kind of is a big issue.
I think that brings us to our next question about how can museums reconcile demands for repatriation with their own future. So you're talking about people having access to items of their heritage.
Yeah.
How
I mean, I
do
just
that?
think that the idea of repatriation brings up kind of the kind of core issue of like if museums are kind of built on the idea that a lot of colonizing powers kind of pillaged these artifacts, I feel like for them to recognize that, you're kind of questioning your entire existence to some sort of degree. I don't know.
Geoffrey Robertson, the human rights lawyer, says that the British Museum is the world's largest receiver of stolen goods. The problem is that where do museums sit now? They have these massive stores of goods that they shouldn't have, that in my opinion they should just give them all back. But then what happens is that you no longer have a British Museum, you no longer have a world culture section, you just have what's left in this building, which is the sections for children and things like that. It's very clear that the aquarium, the Egyptology, that's all for children. But you go into the world cultures and that is for a different audience. It's not presented in the same way at all.
I love that question because I think that there is so much that can be done, and I think what we're really seeing is a lot of kind of dancing around, not too much. So of the objects of varying provenances, because as some people like to stick to, not all of them were stolen under violent and terrible conditions, but we know some were. So you could start there, and these institutions, like the structures that have been created in order to catalogue, I believe that there's enough expertise here to figure out a way to share and to give them back, basically. And then this idea that they'll be empty as well, I find really interesting, because there has to be enough British history and enough stuff to talk about to put some stuff in here, you know? And all of these are like all of the generations of existence that have happened here. Like, I think that there's this space could then be used to tell a really interesting story about history, maybe not through those items, but through other things. And and I think also there are collections of British things here, and that they're not publicized, or that it's all I definitely think Egypt when it comes to going to museums in particular, and that framing doesn't need to exist. I would love to be able to go to a museum. I'm from Birmingham, and I would love to be able to go to a museum and see stuff that told me what Birmingham was like, before.
We've already got that in Liverpool. We've got the Liverpool Museum. Why is that separate? Why is it like a separate thing? You go around the Liverpool Museum, you've got the story of Beatles, you've got the story of Liverpool culture, and then you come here and you've got world culture in a small horseshoe shape, where you travel the world and then you come out and are you none wiser?
It kind of goes back to that whole concept of us and them, like as in this is our history, this is their history, and it's kind of like the fact that still exists kind of continues the narrative of colonialism, continues that kind of perspective. And as well, I think, especially with items in museums, I think like with repatriation, it's awkward because like museums are kind of built on those items. Like if they gave them
they can move on and give them back and kind of redevelop, but that kind of questions, like, the questions their existence, like you said, and then because of that, it's kind of, colonialism isn't in the past, if you get me, so questioning, they don't really want to question their kind of role in that, because then if they do that, they're kind of opening a whole kind of world about colonialism and kind of racism in society, and then it's just, yeah, so I think because it's continuing today, it's kind of awkward for them to actually like consider it. Yeah.
And that's quite funny, isn't it? Because museums, well, it's not funny, but museums kind of are this like mirror of, well, I think museums would be a very good institution in order to mirror parts of society, and you make that really good point of us and them, whereas colonialism actually, we don't know what the world would have looked like if colonialism hadn't happened, but it's presumable that large parts of like societies might have not come to Britain, and there are people here, obviously not everyone, but there are people here because of colonialism, and museums kind of seem to deny that by still separating them, whereas obviously multicultural societies have happened largely because of colonial undertakings, and I think museums are a bit backwards in that, or even denying, probably not, well, might actually be on purpose, but you know, we don't know that, but I think then how can it be an educative system, or how can you claim to educate a society when you're not mirroring what a society looks like? And still I've not been to the Museum of Liverpool in a while, but it is very focused on Liverpool's white history, whereas, you know, Liverpool has been very engaged in non-white activity, as in like slavery, the slave trade, and the Toxteth riots and everything. So I think, yeah.
There's like significant levels of denial though. You look at a museum's level of denial, then you go bigger, you look at the political sphere, then you've also got the British culture as a level of denial of the fact that we will not face up to our colonial past, because to face up to that would be to realise that we were the baddies in history. So it's all good and well talking about repatriation, but we can look at, like, politics is driven, I think, at the moment by this nostalgia of empire, which we can't and seem to will not address.
And I think sorry. You go. I think that comes down to like education. Like, you think of museums as spaces of like education, or even like in the past, like not very nicely, but like entertainment in some respects. But like when you look at outside of museums, when you look at the rest of the country, when you look at how we're talking about these histories, there's not very much truth in it, and I think that comes into like part of the issue is that when you're educating people about it, there's a very strong narrative within that education, and that's a form of kind of colonialism, really.
And I think that's an interesting point, because what you say is like the narrative, and that's what I meant earlier as well with several narratives, because there is one truth in it, and that's the truth of certain people that believe in, you know, unfortunately, because government still does have so much influence on the way that we educate our kids, but also in a sense politics do dominate like what goes into museums and the general understanding of things. And what you mentioned earlier about that a lot of people still do have this positive idea of empire. Sometimes it's because they certainly really don't want to let go of that, and sometimes it is because they get educated that way, and if they later in life don't engage in that topic, all they know is what they've learned at school and what they've seen in museums. So then that's, you know, people can say, but this is my truth, but then how can you only learn from one truth? Then that can't really be established as a truth, right?
Museums are protected by law, like they're not legally allowed to repatriate items, so it comes from the top. Is that not true?
That's actually not true. Fact check.
But it comes down from the legal system and then it trickles down. Like, if government were to launch a review about the British colonial past and understand that better, you would see the institutions mirroring that.
I also think, like, there's the narratives and the socio-cultural and political side of it as well, but as an industry, I think that museums are in their blockbuster moment. If I'm not too old to remember blockbusters, right? Okay. And so museums are like, we're blockbusters. Everyone rents videos. This is how we view stuff. People drop things off at the letterbox when we're closed, because that's convenient, and we're the epitome of convenience, and this is how it's done. And like in various rooms outside of the traditional structure, someone's there coding what will be Netflix. academics, right? And these conversations are happening in parallel, and I think museums are at this point where it's like, it might be uncomfortable to think about changing, but as a business strategy, even at its most cynical, if it's about revenue, if it's about footfall, if it's about ensuring that this industry continues and that curators have jobs and that humanities get funding for other people to continue in this institution, then there has to be some kind of wider business strategy change, or we're all going to be laughing here like, oh, museums, remember when that was that, and we're all here watching things in VR, or I don't know what will happen next.
So on that point then, how do you think museums based in former colonial powers like the UK should represent artefacts gained via colonial operations, or how do they deal with them if they repatriate?
You can get really creative with it though, and I don't think the museum industry is trying hard enough. There's a lady who does uncomfortable art tours down in London called Alice Proctor, who says display it like it's stolen. And I mentioned when we met last week about why aren't we utilising digital technologies like VR? You could create a space that is completely empty, and then you put on a VR headset and you see all the items in their original culture, or you can see the act of them being stolen, and then the person would link the fact that it was not ours to begin with, and then you could also show the journey of that item from original culture, stolen, secondary culture, repatriation. And I think museums could actually turn it on its head and make it really positive. If they make a contribution to repatriation, they could make that into a good press story. It could be a way of driving people back in.
I think that, so I did also similar, I've done a few British museum tours led by a black historian doing a history of Africa thing, and having museums collaborate with these people. These people are in there and they know all this stuff, so why not leverage that? I've been to the Tate for, in fact I've queued for an hour and a half. Everyone says young people don't go to museums, but I've queued for an hour and a half to get into an exhibit, the Tate on two separate occasions. It was 1 in, 1 out on a Friday night in London, because they'd collaborated with these young collectives who then obviously knew what to do to draw people in and what was interesting and what questions people had. And I think leveraging items, leveraging what's going on outside of the physical museum space is going to be really important. And the British Museum tour that I was on, her research had led her to a leaked document where it's the board minutes and the British Museum talks. And sorry to keep focusing on that, but that's what I know best. Where the board had agreed that these items were looted and stolen, but they hadn't personally stolen them, so they were just going to keep them or something like that. And if I was the British Museum, I would blow that up big on a billboard across London. And then I would make, once a month or something, I would pick an artifact and tell the story of that artifact and frame it around that artifact. And people would come to see that, and then you could send it back, and you could generate, with the amount of items that the British Museum has, you could generate footfall from that for until the rest of time, basically. And that's just one example of ways that they could be really creative, and that repatriation doesn't have to be a negative
fun as well.
thing. And also there's incredible amounts of creative, and a lot of the conversation about what do we do if we repatriate, there are so many organisations not in the Western society, academics, cultural organisations, people working on incredible collaborations that the museums could leverage in order to create incredible and engaging work around these items. It doesn't have to be oh well, I don't know anyone. I've emailed 3 British universities and I don't know anyone who knows enough about this artifact. It's well, let's spread it out a bit more.
It's the silence though, what Deana was saying, the silence is deafening. If they engage in a conversation, it's they're scared. They're scared of actually having a two-way conversation with the public, which is why the thing that the Liverpool Museum is doing, which is good, which is they're actually inviting people to write down their thoughts about the World Culture section and pin it to the wall. And I read one of them today that said, stolen artefacts divide us, give them back. And that's true. That's come from someone in the public.
Because the other thing as well that I think about is that actually some of these items have come from personal collections. So it would be really interesting, you know, it's very easy for me to say, I think we should give them back, but someone out there thinks that those items are theirs, and actually the British Museum is loaning them. And so there's that to engage as well, and I don't really know how I go about that. If anyone knows anyone who is loaning items, I'd love to have a cup of tea with them, just because I think it would be really interesting, because I'm currently in a very young 2019 egalitarian kind of liberal bubble where it's like, give them back, it's not a problem. My identity is more invested in what happens next rather than what's happened before. And actually there are plenty of people who's invested, like you've brought up before, there are plenty of people whose story is more invested in what happened in the past, and I think the museum could be a great space for opening up channels of conversation that could help ameliorate some of this identity crisis that I think we're all going through in some way or another, depending on which frame you want to look at.
What about the process of repatriation though? So
planes, ships versus no, I'm kidding.
I don't know whether we should be considering the process. I don't think it's up to us to decide how these items are given back. Of course, give them back properly, make sure they're secure, but why do we feel like we have to dominate these discussions still?
Yeah, I think that's something that like is really like obvious to me. It's just like these conversations are so unequal, like the way that they happen is the fact that museums are sitting around being like, we have all of these items that actually belong to someone else, and they're just being like, oh, should we give them back to you, should we not? It's kind of like, who has all the power in that dynamic, and who has that say? It's just
still the white people.
Yeah.
There's no other, and I think this came up on one of the tours, but like there's no other domain where you let the criminals decide what to do. If I steal a phone from someone, no one's going to let me decide what happens with the phone, how I have to give it back. Other people decide that because I stole it and I obviously want to keep it.
I think that's to like loan it back, like the whole idea of loaning it to the people that it comes from. It's like, what?
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because an argument that what we've also mentioned before is that, well, I didn't steal it, but then on top of that, so then they say I didn't steal it, but then why is it yours to keep? As in, it's okay, it's fair, you haven't stolen it, you haven't physically gone somewhere and stolen it because that was quite a while ago. But why then does that give you the right now to keep it when someone who it actually did belong to is asking for it back and has asked for it back for quite a while, and probably in very neat manners at the beginning, and now finally the discussion is going? But we can all assume, because that's just how it happens, people have had to ask many a times before people actually started listening.
And legally, I think as well, there is an onus on individuals. Like if I buy a car, don't I have to check that it's not stolen? Otherwise they will just come and take it off me and it's my fault because I bought something stolen. So it's interesting in this debate that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work in a similar way.
Well, we don't have a problem with Nazi stolen artworks in the Second World War. They were all given back. Why is this any different?
And I think that's really interesting because there is definitely a racialized perspective to the way that we treat the debate of repatriation, and that stems from the way that things are displayed and stuff. Like, sorry to keep going on about the British Museum, but they have so many artifacts from Africa, and if you go to the British Museum, which is a historical institution, they have modern art. Like their Africa exhibit is it's not that big, and it's not filled with stuff. It feels quite sparse if you go there, in like layman opinions, obviously. I don't know if there's curatorial rules around it. And then like a third of it is modern art. And that's just rude, because it just completely ties into this narrative that like the history of Africa, the history of an entire continent, that's supposedly the oldest continent that existed, it's just, oh, there's not enough, so let's put some modern art in there. I mean... But
also the fact that here, Egypt is split off.
Yeah,
It's in Africa. And you walk into the Egyptology section, right, there's a map on the floor. You look at the map, and it's sectioned to the right of Africa to stress its proximity to Saudi Arabia and those kind of places. It's not situated within the continent, so therefore you're already categorising it as different.
What's the impact, you think, of categorising Egypt
in that way? Why do you think that is done?
It's just that kind of fetishization of it. The whole discipline began with people with curiosities, people being like, oh, this ancient civilization, they're so eccentric, look what they do to their dead, or look how, look at all these weird things they've done, and then it's just kind of built on that. So in a way, museums kind of are continuing that kind of legacy of the discipline of being kind of seeing Egypt as being kind of barbaric and civilized, and like Africa in general is barbaric, and then Egypt being kind of more civilized, more interesting, so kind of closer to us.
It's like why you always see Egyptians as like portrayed as like basically white people in like the media. It's kind of just like tying that ancient civilization to kind of, I like that history is tied in with the same kind of histories that were in the Greek Empire or whatever. All of those are like civil, but then there's a clear separation of like sub-Saharan Africa, which is obviously very like barbaric, very like
the long notion of the civilization progress of like the ancient Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, and then you fast forward, and then here comes the British.
And I don't think we can underestimate, going back to what you were saying about the impact, like and what you were talking about colonial violence, like we often frame it as colonial violence as a countrywide thing or a historical thing, and actually it really matters. Like people can talk for days about the disenfranchisement of certain minority groups. In particular, I can speak about the black community, and it's because you walk into a museum and everything that you're told is that you have no history and no identity and you never contributed anything. So no wonder you don't feel bought in to the system. And I think that increasingly I'm definitely starting to see how that narrative how that narrative, when it plays out in other places, just really, really affects people. It really affects me, and I'm tired. Well, one of the things that I think museums could really help with is this framing of history as something that everyone has something to be proud of, and it doesn't have to be a war zone. It is a war zone, but we don't have to take knives back into that war zone and relive violence. Like there are stories there that exist and that are important for identity and for heritage, for people that that don't have to be represented in such a.
What I find interesting from what you say is that as a white person, I've never really had to think about this, because I do go to a museum, and generally if there is a section on that's close to like my own culture, it speaks to me because it speaks to the white person that's viewing that. And I guess what I find what's important to hear from what you say is that when black British people go to museums, in the case of Britain or any other form of colonial power, that you're not included in the white history, because for some reason they're completely excluded from that, even if there was black people present in it. Think about World War II, for instance. But then also the black history that is portrayed is still written from a white perspective, yet not acknowledging the white negative contribution in it, but also not informed enough in order to let you experience your own history. So you're completely, an entire group is completely excluded from the museum that's supposed to be so. And then funnily enough, when the argument is given why to keep these artifacts, is to say people can come and visit, but in what settings will they see them? In completely irrelevant, might not even be, lacking truth, or just being completely the opposite of the truth.
And it's like people can come and visit, but if we're saying that if they come and visit, this is the only narrative that they get to see, like why would you? Do you know what I mean? Like why would you give up a day? Like why would I give up a day to be told like a very limited, very narrow view of history, when thankfully like I'm in a position where I have access to do other things, and if I wasn't interested in academia I run events like narrative and coaching, like therapeutic events for people of the African diaspora based on reclaiming traditions lost during slavery and colonialism. And so people who do all sorts of different things, like taxi drivers, and I can only think of my one friend who's a taxi driver now, but not all academics basically, and they are suspicious of museums. I think that's the right word. And so it's not and in order to get past your suspicion, in order to go something, you have to give energy, you have to give emotion, and you have to give mental capacity to wrap your head around the fact that you feel like you should just be walking into a room, but it's loaded and you're not entirely sure why. Who wants to do that on a Saturday? No.
Museums are like, I would say, places of representation of power structures.
Yeah.
So why not museums flip it on its head? Again, it can be something really positive. If you represent British culture as it is and how we want to show it, then it could be something to be championed. But there's this like dragging the heels.
But I think it's, to come back to what you said, I think it's first and foremost very hurtful and negative for people who aren't represented in museums. But I think it's also in general for the whole wider public quite hurtful, because is it all right to represent a fake or at least half true, not even half, like limited truth to people who do think that this is their culture? Because this way you do teach white children that they were born in a white country, first of all, because you portray it as a white country, who did something really good by starting the empire. Like, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but in a way, can we then even blame them? Like, you need to look at the roots, and I think it's very, it's for everyone, it's hurtful for the entire country, basically.
It's completely fundamentally wrong that we teach children that the empire was a good thing.
Yeah.
Like, we don't tell children that Liverpool was built on money from slavery. That is not seen, it's not obvious to children. Like, I didn't come across any negative assessment of the British Empire until I started my undergraduate degree, and it wasn't really until my third year. And that's only because I've chosen that path and I wanted to learn about that. Like, there's no acknowledgement of anything like that in public discourse.
And on that point, obviously you just mentioned that you've chosen to study areas, or you've chosen specific tutors for their reputation of decolonising the curriculum. But in general, how should universities and former colonial powers address colonialism, both its past and its legacies, in its teaching, do you think?
I think with Liverpool, the point is just to address it. Like, it hasn't been addressed at all. Like, nobody learns about the history of the university, the history of slavery in the city, Black British history in the city. You don't learn about any of that. Be that like within your degree if you're studying history or politics or whatever you're studying, or just outside of that during Black History Month, during all of these things, like there needs to be some sort of conversation that needs to take place where these things are getting addressed.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at history, you look at the reading lists is a really important one, I think. Reading lists should be diverse, should be representative of the field and also of the opinions. For example, we, in our master's programme, have a critical race theory seminar. All three of the required readings were from white scholars, and I don't know if that is, that shouldn't be happening, really. Because
and if it does, you should point that out.
Exactly.
You should have an argument as to why you do that. There needs to be an idea behind it, rather than this way it just seemed to be that there hadn't, it was just because convenience, yeah?
I was in that class and I was the only black person in it, and it was particularly traumatic for a number of reasons. I think that universities, it's tough because obviously I've chosen to come back to university and I've had some time, a little bit of time out. I won't give away how old I am. But it's tough because actually none of the people who I consider my community outside of people who I've met here expect me to have a pleasant, diverse time, and I think that's odd because I've obviously met I've met a lot of very interesting people here who aren't racists or bigots or colonial descendants obsessed with that part of their history, but the way but everything, all of my conversations in coming to university have been very much, seems to have been very much in hindsight about preparing me for that, for approaching university as a structure, as of that kind of ilk. And I think reading lists is a very important way that could be addressed. And then also, I guess, maybe just branding. I think if 2019 from like a marketing and advertising perspective has taught us anything, it's that, you know, you can literally rebrand. It doesn't, like, the facts are the facts, but you can brand them however you want, and it doesn't matter. Like, it matters, but you can take ownership of a story, and a negative thing doesn't have to be a negative in a way. If you look at the core goals of a university, which is, I guess, to earn money and get students, yeah, something like that, earn money and get students, there are ways that those, and attract other world-class talent, maybe, I don't know. There are ways of talking about, like, Liverpool could use its history to benefit itself there, and to be at the forefront of all the stuff that university is trying to, like, I think a university is trying to do.
And I think especially then I think about the history department, and I didn't do my undergraduate here, so I don't know exactly how that was formed, but I can speak from my own undergraduate experience. And I think, you know, history, everyone does history for different amounts of reasons, and history in itself is a course, but history is present in different courses when you think about sociology, philosophy, most humanities studies, but also outside of that. And I think sometimes the link doesn't really get made enough to that they really need to teach us what happened, but also how that informed our current society, how that sort of influenced our current society. And I think when you make that link without even putting too much of an emotion in it, people will get to understand how certain things work, and that when people talk about white people, that they don't mean that you personally went out on a slave ship, but that it does, the way that your ancestors have done it has influenced how you now profit from white privilege. And I think, you know, too often in academia, I really find that we preach to the converted, because the people that engage in the difficult discussions already have that opinion. But in order to make that more broad, you need to explain to white people specifically, whilst not excluding others, why certain power relations and ideas are formed because of what happened in the past, without blaming them too much, because then people shy away. But you know, I think, and universities, I think it should start way earlier in life, but I think when that's not done, universities could play a really crucial role in letting people understand broader society.
Like jumping on a cultural wave though, you can be on the right side of this if you get on top of it and follow it. Like, for example, the Me Too movement, I think that has done really great things for people to understand the prevalence of sexual violence and the patriarchy. You know, bring it back to museums, Manchester Art Gallery removed a pre-Raphaelite artwork with naked women on it, and that prompted a discussion. You can do the same with decolonisation.
And yeah, speaking about the Me Too movement, so last week when we were speaking, I was talking about this idea that we talk about universities and we talk about museums and structures to try and keep it back on the university thread. But increasingly we're getting to a point where, because of the internet, because of these kinds of discussions, like, people are, we're getting to a point where it's not the film industry versus young actors, it's this person and that person going toe to toe, and actually, like, it's going to be museum curators and directors of universities who individually are going to have to say, I continue to make these decisions and I stand by them because X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, actually, if you had to look someone in the eye, like just a regular person on the street, like, it's all well and good being like, as a university, we've decided that and yes, we're aware of this, and we've decided that being aware is enough, or whatever. But when an individual has to look another individual in the eye and be like, yeah, I know that I profit off you and I don't care to do anything to help you, that's a different matter. And all of a sudden you have people who, like the Me Too movement has shown, that institutions can't protect people forever. And I think on an individual level, everyone is making decisions on a daily basis. And it's not saying that everyone has to become perfect. There's a lot to learn, there's a lot to cover, and no one person can fix it all. But I think we should all be trying to go home at night and go to sleep thinking that we haven't, that we've been aware, that we've tried to point ourselves in this other direction a little bit, because we're going to have to justify it to people very soon, and increasingly.
Yeah, just like hold ourselves accountable for, like, yeah, so kind of universities and stuff recognising that it's not they have a role in that structure. It's not just a structure, if you get me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And as students as well, it's like, yeah, okay, I've been through a course where I like all the required readings of white people, and this is the structure of the course, but what am I doing to contribute to a world where these conversations are easier? How am I using my expertise, my platform, my access to the library, and my privilege to make sure that at least one other person is, I don't know, is less intimidated and feels like they could come to uni, or some other person understands that actually there's a bit of nuance around this element of history here, and it's not as simple as X, Y, Z. And we all have tools like Facebook and Instagram and voices and eyes at our disposal to contribute massively to these.
It's like I've read 3 white scholars. Am I okay with that? If I'm not, then you do the work yourself. You read someone else. Like, the onus is on the person to really start the debate and to talk. But it's the same as museums. Universities are shrouded in silence, and silence is the thing that's going to kill them if they don't get onto it. They have to engage with it, and engage with the public as well as the internal institution. Otherwise, it's just going to mount up.
And I think on sharing what people have found, like Lawrence Westcraft, who does a history tour, a Liverpool and slavery group, who does a history tour every Sunday, and that, I think that's an amazing example of being like, you know what, like, obviously he's an academic, so he's a product of these structures, but he's doing incredible work in just telling the story and sharing it in a way that is, you know, relatively physically, obviously there are limits, but it's an accessible way, it's captivating, and if we all like shared, I don't know, something that we'd learned that was outside of the traditional narrative, like once a month or something, that is going to snowball and it's going to grow. It doesn't take
accessibility though. That's the important thing. It's that people need to feel that they can enter a debate and maybe make mistakes. Put your hands up and say, I made a mistake there. It's like, I think a lot of straight white men fear getting involved in a debate about racism and about colonialism because they'll say the wrong thing, but by being silent, you're not doing anything.
And we touched upon this, Emma touched upon this earlier about other subjects as well. So we talked a lot about history, but how does decolonising curriculum affect subjects outside of history? You know, thinking about medicine or ancient history and Egyptology, you know.
Sorry, do you want to go with it?
I was just going to say, like, I guess it's just being open about the history of a discipline or kind of where it's come from, instead of just kind of being like, oh, in medicine we know this, kind of being kind of like cross-disciplinary and kind of expanding, rather than just being like, oh, we do biochemistry, we do medicine, kind of being like, oh, we do medicine, but we'll tell you more where it came from or like how it links to society and things like that, kind of being more, and that will not only make, I feel like it will not only make people better medics, but also make them better people in society, really.
I think medicine is a really important one as well, because I think, like, one way that I see it play out is in this vaccine debate, and I've got a lot of very excellent medics on my feed being like, why would people vaccinate their kids? And I've noticed a lack of nuance and understanding why, especially communities of colour, I can't speak to others, but communities of colour have a suspicion, because there's increasing evidence, and communities know of times when doctors have used things like vaccines to sterilise groups of people, or for like negative testing, or like the Tuskegee experiment and things like that. And if you're a doctor and you're looking at like a young black mom and they're suspicious of you, you need to know these things, because it doesn't matter. You can show them what the ingredient list, you can show as many studies as you want, but if you can't address, if you're not being taught that there are like cultural and societal reasons why, outside of how good you are at medicine, that affect how people are going to engage with your services, then you're constantly kind of going to be speaking to someone who's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to get on the same page. And I think decolonising curriculums where the cultural aspect of those things are taught, and when reading lists aren't all white, then you'd come across that a bit more, and you'd be like, oh yeah, actually there are all these times when people have been in my situation and have maybe abused that, so I need to be aware of that when I'm speaking to people. And even if it's just a case then of being able to be like, I have to bring someone else in, or maybe I'm not like maybe I need to go away and learn a bit more in order to be able to address that properly. Those kind of things, opening up those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think a lot of the products of imperialism and colonialism and just all of these prejudices that are a lot of the time internalized aren't specific to subjects or like moments in history. They're so like far-reaching in terms of every aspect of people's lives. So like you need to address them at all of these levels in order to actually dismantle them. I think.
It's like you do like a class at the beginning of every degree of like, where has our discipline come from? Who did we exploit? Why are we privileged enough to learn this? And then from the beginning, you know where its roots are.
Thinking about as well, like what the barriers were for you getting to your point, and how those barriers might affect other people. So like, obviously we're on the other side of fee payments, and thinking about the way that structure might exclude other people will then enable you, if you're like, okay, how can I, like in decolonising, if I can't break that structure, how can I make sure that there's permeation through it? So like thinking about that.
Yeah, like you said, socio-economic.
Yeah, I guess
barriers
it's
as well.
I guess it's like understanding the context of not just the subject, but how we as humans have come to be able to be in that subject, and then making sure that if there are barriers that we face, we're aware of them. If we can tackle those barriers, great, let's do it. If not, what else can that awareness create that helps other people as well as ourselves and these advantages that we've got?
It's like, why is America got so many tech startups? Like, where's the linking there? Where does it all come from? Economics, where, the kind of the big chain.
And that is a doozy, because tech startups, and I guess therefore like museums as well, the adult panel brought this up, it's the element of funding, the adult panel. It's this element of funding, right? Because we are, like, I guess if I'm the one signing the checks, I get to have incredible say over what's happening, but I'm not signing the checks, just in case anyone was curious. So whatever, I guess there maybe needs to be a conversation about what we can do to tackle, like to speak to those people and be like, okay, if you're allocating the year's funding for X, Y, and Z, we're interested in some of it coming over here, please. And I honestly there's not a lot of transparency over how that works, and so that's a really big thing we could do with more transparency and more access.
So I think we've got time for one more question. So what does the ongoing ownership and display in British museums of looted or stolen objects, all those obtained through unequal power relations, reveal about legacies of empire generally, and how can we address these in wider society? It's a big question. It's how I didn't write that one.
In a way, the way they display it kind of continually shows that power relation is still ongoing, that even if it's not as explicit as like kind of explicit war or violence, it's still there, it's still viewed as, we took this is ours now, like we can display it, it's up to, like, we have the power over these objects, and it's kind of beyond the object, if you get me. It's not like, I don't know, like, as in, say like the Elgin marbles, it's not just the marbles, it's the what they represent, and it's the same with other objects that have been taken. So it's kind of that continuing like legacy shown through how they treat those objects.
What's the impact of that in wider society, do you think, Kazar? Beyond the museum?
I think it, to a certain extent, reinforces this kind of, or it can feed into a narrative of like, that at one point, on both sides is the strength, but also the fragility of like whiteness and white structures. And like, I think that's maybe a bit of a nuanced understanding coming from me, but I definitely see this discourse around like identity and people like, well, I'm white and this is the whiteness that I've got, and it means that, and it comes from this legacy of 500 years of X, Y, and Z, but also then that feels quite powerful, like it should be quite powerful, because there's a lot of violence and me getting what I want that's included in it. but then also this feeling like at any moment it might be taken away, and then that feeds into, like a negativity or a fragility that I don't really think helps anyone, and it then makes the conversation quite hard to have, because are you talking about something that actually is a construct that will be fine and will exist whether or not the museums are full or not, or is it something that if you get rid of any of these things, all of a sudden the whole house of cards comes falling down?
Denial. Still, again, it's like it is true that the white construct is so fragile because people know the truth. Well, you either know the truth or you're not aware that you know the truth, but it's there if you look for it.
So, thank you very much. So, I'd like to open the floor for questions now. If anyone's got any questions for our panel? Yeah?
Hey everyone. Pardon me. Thank you for a really, really interesting, Thank you for a really, really interesting and engaging discussion. There was so much in there that I found absolutely fascinating and really, really helpful. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, in one of my roles I work as a curatorial assistant for a small collection, and we do have objects from other cultures. And I completely agree with everything that you're saying in terms of, I think, we should be starting to think about repatriation. And as you say, the mechanisms by which we repatriate shouldn't be dictated by museums, with the caveat that we need to make sure they're going back to the right people. You can't just, say, oh, this is from Africa, give it to someone from Africa. So I think there does need to be some engagement with the mechanisms. But, on the whole, I really agree with you. In terms of displaying objects from other cultures, I can think of a million and one ways to put together displays about other cultures and about work cultures as sensitive and as celebrate those cultures. At what point, and I also agree that we need to engage in this sort of, in the violence of empire and colonialism, but I think there are two stories, and this is something that I've struggled with when I put sort of museum displays together, especially with Egyptian collections where the violence of empire is sometimes slightly more nuanced because everyone goes, oh, we got it legally. But of course there's, there's a very specific socio-economic situation that allow people to go to Egypt and acquire those objects legally. What do you think we should separate, or at what point should we separate, or how should we separate the secondary story of an object that is its violent colonial history, and from the object itself as a celebration, and whether it's an object or a replica or whatever it is, as a celebration of the culture that it comes from, and a way to be able to educate white British people about the diversity of the world that's out there beyond Britain. Sorry, that was a really
Does that
make sense?
Yeah, it's actually, we actually talked about this quite a bit, and I think, especially when you look at ethnology museums like these, there is a lot of artifacts that are out there, and I don't know as much about Egyptology, that would be you more in the section here, but even when you look at, for instance, African artifacts that are very beautiful, but have completely different meaning to us than they do to them. And I agree with you that the argument that goes quite a lot is that, if we give everything back, then do we just stop teaching white British people, or at least just British people in general, about...
just to make it clear, I do think that things should be
I get but how to do that then, and I think what we discussed, what all of us thought, often these artifacts do have a specific, often religious or cultural meaning to people from their home country, to call it like that, because it's all dependent where they're from, and I think, and for us, they just teach us something, and I've viewed this in a little bit of a way of why we fortunately don't use people anymore in museums, but we use mannequins to just show that how people hunted, or how people, depending on what exhibition you go to. So why not recreate some of the pieces, for instance, with the knowledge that we do have, because they've been here for so long, we have really bright people in museums that can study them well. And then obviously I think there always needs to be a conversation with people that know a lot about it. So for instance, what you brought up is like, is it always accurate? Can we recreate it? And there might be artifacts that can't be recreated due to their purpose, but there might be some out there that could be recreated. So why not let us recreate them, still educate people, but the original artifact that does have that meaning to people can go back. And I think that would be one of the better ways to sort.
There's an interesting thing at the moment about 3D printing of items, where we create an amazing replica, send the original home. So that basically, I think, is a really good solution, because you've still got exactly the same thing. It looks identical, but the original, the thing that has the significance, is back in its
because why would we need the original if it doesn't have?
I think.
Sorry.
So go on.
So go on, what are you going to say? I think we're going to say what I was going to say.
I'm not sure what I just was trying to get straight, like the two parts of the framing of, I guess, description of items.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily whether or not we display originals or replicas or some things that, it's how do we tell those two parallel stories. So you tell the secondary story of the object or of the culture or of the people without overshadowing the fact that other people have this amazing culture that we need to learn about.
And I think the little itty bitty cards are tough. And so utilising what you can outside of those is important. And I've seen a lot of, obviously, like this is a really great example. We've got a collection, we're running an exhibition, but we're also going to have people talking and stuff, so that there's like multifaceted ways of engaging with the story as well. And I think, I guess, instead of trying to condense down the story and being like, okay, if someone's got 30 seconds, what's the elevator pitch of this item? Yeah, okay, maybe having that as a starting point, but then drawing it out so that you have, like maybe there's a QR code next to it, which is a video of more information. Maybe it's the list of like what other events are happening. Maybe it's like mapping, there's this item over here that also tells another story. And yeah, just I guess, does that?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I love the QR code idea, because that's something that you don't have to redesign an entire exhibition. You can just stick the QR code in, and then people can.
And the great thing about those is that they're static links, and you can change what goes up there. And you know, everyone loves. You can use videos and text and music and stuff, and so that's no worries.
We've literally got peel-off vinyls, so you
Yeah.
can just stick the thing over the object.
Which is what Deana's done. If you've not been to the trail, honestly do the trail, it's great.
Yeah. So you're telling another story, but yeah, you can change that story.
And what is quite powerful is actually the contrast between the objects in this nice little cabinet, and then Deana's like stuck this thing on it, being like this was stolen or decapitated. It's really shocking. Sorry, next question.
First, I would like to say that thank you so much for this. I'm very interested into colonialism and post-colonialism, being an Algerian and not rooted. But the second of all, it is amazing how to see the idea of museum changes from a culture to another. Because in my own country, we have Martyr Museum. God, I spent 2 days crying after getting into this museum, and the educational system really teach us about the colonialism as a whole. Now, a third point, and I would love to hear your opinion. I think in one way or another, the museums are a reflection of inner racism that some people have. I talked to a British lady from African descent, and when we were talking, obviously Algeria is an African, which you know, was like, I talked to her, and then I told her, so I'm Algerian, I'm African fellow, and then she looked at me and she said, like, you don't look like an African. I was like, that's how African look like, you know? And it's like, so the second time I met her, I introduced her to a Moroccan, and then she said, oh, she's our other African descent. I was like, yeah, you know, she is. So it's like amazing when I see, for example, the African part of the museum. I don't see Algeria over there. I don't see Morocco. I don't see other parts that do not look like, or do not have like dark chocolate skin.
Yeah.
You know? Like, since like we're different, but I'm African also, but they don't show that. So we think that
addressing all these different cultures. There's definitely like a very like black African and then like Inuit, or do you know what I mean? Like there's like a phenotype that fits that we see on display, and it makes me really curious. Like, what about all the other stuff that they have? Like, because there's been a very careful selection process that means that if you go to the British Museum, the 6 things that you see that are African, like out of millions maybe. So I think that is a very good question, and I think it is. I try not to think about it, but yeah, like the people who fund these, the people who have the millions of pounds that donate large amounts to funding these universities are so far removed in terms of story from me that actually, yeah, like maybe there is definitely a question to be asked about the fact that some people are probably presenting what they see of the world, and it would be naive for me to assume that if I was sat in a room full of funders, they might not have some horrible assumptions about me and who I am and the world that I come from and what I like to do in my spare time. And I think that's really important. I think it's something that can be addressed through events like this and stuff. Like the more we reclaim our own stories, fine. But maybe, yeah, like the people who fund universities are like, this is what I want people to know about Africa, and it serves them. So yeah, if anyone knows any cup of tea, let me know.
I'd also say that I think this kind of homogenous idea of Africa is something that kind of came from a really clear place. The whole idea of Africa, which is like a really diverse continent full of millions of people that speak thousands of languages that are from thousands of different cultures, and it's kind of all portrayed as kind of this one person. Yeah, and like North Africa is different because obviously they've got lighter skin and like the whole Arabic thing, and like that's separate. There's a clear like civilization separation thing that goes on there, and I think that's like a remnant of colonialism. That's the imperial like way of thinking of like these are all kind of one group of people. They work this way. They work in like tribes, and this is how you kind of deal with them. And that's still here today. Like there's nothing. There's change, but you know.
But the world cultures section here, you're literally walking in a horseshoe. You go from different sections without real demarcation. You're just walking around the world in a little shape. Whereas, and also the rest of the exhibitions here are really colourful. They're really vibrant. They've got key colours of the aquariums like blue, and the natural world bit's green. And then you walk into the world cultures bit, and the main colour is white. And you're like, what is this saying? I walk into a space with loads of light and white light, and I'm like, and all the objects are all behind glass. There's this level of separation still. It's the us and them thing.
I went to another panel recently, and it was, I think, Dr. Rafif Ziada at SOAS, I want to say. It was talking about something slightly different, but this quote has stuck in my head, and it's like, there is no tinkering with racist projects. And actually I'm here because I believe that most of the people in museums have got incredible knowledge and incredible intent, and that amazing things can be done with it. But it would, that isn't the whole story of the debate, because there are some people who quite rightly believe that off the basis of the history of museums and the people who actually have the final say on what goes, the people who control who gets where money goes and things like that. That certain projects have to be fundamentally and radically restructured in order to create change, and that painting it black one time isn't going to.
No, but I'm just talking about what it says when you walk into that space.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, I personally think that it would be great to see. I'm personally still quite optimistic and quite excited to see what museums do, because there is so much scope for amazing things, and I've been to some really positive things, and I've spoken to people who are like really, really engaging. So I think that it's definitely onwards and upwards. Yeah.
Any other questions? No. I've got a quick question. You mentioned about restructuring. What do you guys think that, or anyone in the audience, thinks that the restructuring of museums should look like? So what do we mean when we say we need to restructure them in order to address this problem?
I think kind of moving beyond the idea of the object. Like there's a huge focus that the only way you can learn about X thing is through this object. Like the only way you can learn about Egypt is through the mummies or the Rosetta Stone. The only way you can learn about like parts of Africa is if you see the objects. I think we kind of museums need to move past the idea of that and be like, well, you can learn about X culture, Y culture. You don't have to physically see. Like, you know what I mean? It's very like, if you don't see the object, then have you actually learned about it? And I think they need to move past that, especially with like the VR, the 3D printing can help with that, from moving beyond the object and actually.
It's making exhibitions more immersive and more theatrical, borrowing from theatre in the way that they create spaces where you feel like you're. There's a lot of immersive theatre that's going on at the moment where you are entering into a world. It's about doing that, but it's also about the people leading those new ways being from different cultures. You're only going to represent what you have on a board or a funder, like you say. So it needs to be that the people doing it are diverse, and then you will see the diverse product.
I love the collaborative format and also the like lakes format as well, because I think it can be a really good testing ground for projects and ideas outside of really like having to immediately be like, okay, we're going to scrap this whole thing and change it, because that is quite a daunting thing. And yeah, by like by setting up events and collaborating with like local stakeholders and people with specific interests and that kind of thing, and really utilising the networks, because if anyone has like a great platform for building a collaborative network of thinkers who want to run immersive or any other events, it's these places.
It's about having fun with it though. Like the tape thing works because you've got alcohol involved, the drink, like making it like a thing that's. But I mean, like Manchester Art Gallery have a thing every Friday night or every Thursday where it's open late. They have a DJ and you get there's drinks. It's just so it makes the institutions seem less rigid and more open.
Okay, but also aside from the booze,
you know what I mean?
Like
just more casual.
So the one of them that I went to, they had like they curated works. I think it was a wrapper that they put into all these classical paintings. As well, they'd actually curated like a really strong series of events with spoken word and like culturally, it wasn't just a ton of food. Like they were like culturally and like academically relevant events happening there. It wasn't just like we'll open late and turn it into a bar.
I think the relevance thing is really important. Like there needs to be a way of making these kind of old historical kind of really rigid things. You need to bring them into like the now, into the present, and make it relevant to not just like the white people that kind of will mostly be going to these places, but for everyone, and making it inclusive for everyone, and making everyone have something there for them. So I think
which is a good point actually, because that obviously that like late idea speaks particularly to me and my people, but there are different segments that all have, all pay taxes and where public funding comes into these institutions. That's why I think collaborating with you then don't have to say, okay, I've got the expertise. You can collaborate with the Women's Institute, you can collaborate with bird watchers, you can collaborate with any organisation and run like a 2-day event. Like that's not that deep. You've got the expertise there, and they've got a community already, so you're guaranteed certain footfall unless you really balls it up. So yeah.
It sounds like we've ended on a bit of a positive there, which is good. Have you got a final question?
Yeah, I have a question. So you warm the cockles of my heart, if that is such a thing. What is a cockle of the heart? To hear all of you, I've not packed this panel with my students. Only one is a former student, sort of still a student, I suppose. Here's what the question I have for you. So one of the challenges that the UK faces in dealing with any of the issues that you're talking about, and you'd all be well aware of this, you mentioned the lack of knowledge among the general public. David mentioned things like, there's a pretty clear connection between Brexit and this lack of general knowledge, right? So we know that this lack of knowledge has serious ongoing repercussions today. If you look at the UK history curriculum as it was reconstructed by the Conservatives in 2013, you know, it's Stalin, Hitler, and a bit of Tudors or Stuarts, right? And there's nothing remotely to do with empire. Maybe it works in a bit, but when it does, actually, it's all imperial historians, and it's just a very, very particular white male sort of view of empire. There's nothing. We're a series of islands. There's nothing about our connection with the world of which we're a part, right? So we have that problem. There was also a report published by the Royal Historical Society last year about race and ethnicity in UK history teaching, and it just showed the state of affairs was dire from school on through university. Most of the people doing it are white. Most of them don't know foreign languages because it's actually possible. This was a shock to me coming from the US, where it takes 9 years to get a history PhD. You get a bit old. But you have to know languages. I couldn't be an Indian historian without Indian languages. You can in the UK. That they don't know the languages, that we have students who don't have to study languages. You know, and that in fact we have a higher proportion of academics studying British history than any other part of the world in comparison to other countries. So in other words, you could go to the Netherlands or the US or whatever, and there would be fewer people studying the history of that country. So we have all of these things that we still have to work through. We're decades behind where other countries are. To be fair, we're actually an imperial rather than a colonial country. And we're in the same boat as all former imperial states, because none of them have grappled with their imperial histories and the legacies. So what fascinates me about all of you is, where did you come from? In the sense of, how have you come to this impressive level of knowledge, understanding of colonialism, thinking through these institutions and structures? What was it that took you down a certain path? Is it all self-taught? Did you have some amazing education? Is it enlightened parents? Is it, you know, I'm curious.
Well, for me, I'm actually from another imperial country. I'm from the Netherlands, and actually for me, when I came to university for a couple of years, this discussion had been going on, you might have heard about it, which is that the Netherlands is still using blackpeat, which is like a black-facing thing. And that is, amongst young people, fortunately, are very starting to become very resistant against that. So I think also I grew up in a very middle-class, left-wing, you know, environment where these discussions, I guess, are maybe a bit more accessible or something. I don't, you know, how to explain that, I don't really know, but I think basically, when that discussion got going, so many questions came up that I then realised I'd never have to ask myself. So then when I went into university, I just immediately sort of tried to take that route a little bit more, and I also did history and English, and in the English department of my former uni, there was a lot more attention to post-colonial theory, so I guess by studying it through literature as well, I got interested in the history side of it. So yeah, that's basically it.
I don't really know, to be honest, because I mean, I'd say maybe as well, coming from, like, my parents are quite liberal, quite left-wing, so kind of coming from a political perspective as well, because I am quite interested in politics as well, kind of how that links to history as well in a way, in colonialism. And then I think as well the internet is a massive resource, as in, if that didn't exist, I don't think I would know anything about the empire at all. I don't think I ever did it at school. I just did like Stuarts, Tudors, like Russia, like with Stalin, stuff like that. So I think, just the fact that the internet is a thing and kind of like is opening kind of like these discussions and routes as well. Yeah.
I think my schooling, like, I did have like a good enough schooling, and a few teachers who were like, school isn't it. Like, we're teaching you, like, these are skills how to study, these are skills how to find information, these are skills how to assess information, but not all of it is here. In particular, like, one English teacher who was always like trying to teach us interesting stuff that wouldn't be on the curriculum, and he constantly, and like there's always someone who's like, but that's not on the curriculum, and he'd be like, but life isn't on the curriculum, like, you have to go out and study these other things. And then for me, the Brexit vote happens, and I speak German, and I always considered that I might like live in whenever I'm job hunting, if I'm changing job, I'm always looking in Germany as well as here. Like, I took that completely for granted, and that my black, British, slightly German, quite liberal version of being English was, the Brexit vote happened, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe some people disagree with me and my version of who I am and what that means. So that really sent me down a rabbit hole where I was looking more into questions of identity and heritage, which brought me back to university. And I think if you're as a black person, there are those questions are inherent. So addressing those and accessing, and also really using the internet to find people who are talking about those things, and going to talks and panels, because you learn a lot from lots of different people without having to get through a whole book. So
I think I would say that the political climate in the last 8 years has taught me that you have to know the facts about things. So the Brexit vote's really interesting, because that was a kind of catalyst moment for me, where I was being faced with people coming at me with knowledge about the empire, and I needed to know the facts. So I armed myself with the facts, and now I am I know the truth. And it's also about looking at historiography as a discipline, and the societies around that, and looking at the texts and going, there's silence here. There's where have these people profited from? Who have they exploited? And when you follow those questions, you realise the truth about the British Empire and European empires in general.
I think for me, I'm from London, so kind of growing up in a really diverse place where you have kind of both sides of the spectrum, that always kind of made me think about these kind of issues, but also coming from a family where my parents are immigrants to this country. My grandparents were directly lived under Italian colonialism. So there's a really direct connection with these conversations and these challenges, and seeing these differences. I feel like I've been, as I think as a person of colour, you're kind of aware of constantly, you're kind of not allowed to kind of not be aware of it, just because of how much it impacts your existence, or the way you walk through the world. But I think for me, seeing from quite a young age, kind of what the actual full spectrum looks like what it's like for me, but then also what it's like for someone who has no idea what somebody else would experience. I think seeing that has always made me kind of challenge that, and I think that's what more people need. I think.
Yeah. And one last thing as well is that my mum always allowed for me to challenge the status quo. She didn't put it in language like that, but you said no offensive language, so I'm not going to swear. But yeah, basically that it might be difficult, and it might take a lot of time, and you might have to really go 5 steps back in order to move forward. But if it's not working for you, you don't have to accept that that is the way that it needs to stay. And that's probably what brought me here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I thought they were amazing. Should we give them a
Can I just say that one remark? We need more of you.
I wish they were all in my classrooms. I introduced a new module at the University of Liverpool that all history first years take. So we have over 200 students now. We've taught it twice, called The Global History of the Present, and the idea is to explore literally the global histories behind contemporary events, and the way peoples from all over the world have shaped these events. And it's really actually a module to do with empire and how it, I'll try not to swear, messed up the planet. And but it is that sense for me as an educator, that constantly sort of Sisyphus pushing a rock uphill, because you get these 200 students and they sit there and they're like deer caught in headlights. What happened? Where are the Tudors? Where's the military history? This isn't what I thought history was about, and so it's a very big job, and there's an awful lot to do to decolonize public spaces, to decolonize our educational institutions, And this is an ongoing project. So there's an awareness that we need to do that in the UK. There's an awareness at the University of Liverpool that this is something we really have to do. So this discussion is part of a process, and we intend to build on it. And you'll be hearing from me. And also, we're going to send you some feedback forms, and we'd really, really appreciate it if you feed them back. So the idea is that we've got no money to do any of this. It's just pure willpower sort of really driving it. But the idea is to build on this. What can we do with the museum? That's maybe we can do something really big, like a full-on exhibition, right? Maybe there's something we can do at the University of Liverpool that really pushes this issue in new directions. And your voices are all important to that. So we need feedback to make any of that possible. So we'll send you that. And if you could send us the feedback, that would be fantastic. And if you haven't done it yet, do try the trail. This is running until Saturday. University of Liverpool students have been staffing it on the weekends. So they're out in the galleries talking to people and doing an amazing job. And what I will say, what's been interesting from this project so far, this is part of the museum's attempt to see, well, how much enthusiasm is there amongst the British public for this? How much tolerance is there? How far can we go with what we're doing here? And so far the reception has been really positive. There's only been one person, as far as I know, who spoke to a student who asked him, would you like to do this trail? You can learn all about empire and the history of the objects in the collection. And he just thought that was plain impolite. Who just said, but that's not positive. And to me, this is positive, because we tend to think of empire as something that happened out there, and it happened to other people, mostly non-white people. But it happened to us, right? It's also about the culture that constructs that, and how we learn from that, and all those sorts of things. And so to me, that's a super positive thing, right? To create new spaces and new ways of thinking and new ideas. To me, that's brilliant. So that's the long-term project. So yeah, thanks again for coming to you as well.
Thank you.